Today, she will tell us more about personal data abuse in Web 3.0. So let's welcome Kitty Horlick.
Hi, guys. Just give me a moment. Great, so hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Kitty, obviously, and I work for a company called Rarify Labs. I'm the CEO, and we do two things. So firstly, we build infrastructure that changes the way that you relate to your data online, and it allows you to kind of store it as opposed to relying on third parties and big companies to store it and to really own your digital identity. But secondly, we build apps on top of that infrastructure that kind of make this dream of user-owned identity a reality. So the app that we're actually best known for is the tool is a tool called Freedom Tool, which supports completely tamper-proof and surveillance-free voting. And it's been used around the world, mostly so far by protesters in Russia and Iran, but it was also used by opposition MPs in Georgia. So I'll get into that further down in the talk, but before I begin, I kind of wanted to do like a litmus test and see how familiar everyone here already is with blockchain. So if you are confident that you understand blockchain like as a technology, could you put your hand up? Okay, great. So I will definitely still include some of the explainers then so that everyone can follow along. So I think to really understand the concept of Web3 and how we're going to use data in Web3, you kind of have to go back and trace the evolution of the internet and how identity is changing as it continues to evolve. So when the internet first kind of burst onto the scene, it was what we call a write-only internet. So this is Web 1. And it was mostly static pages. So you could go on and you could like read blog posts and you could read news, but you couldn't really interact with it. You couldn't send messages or like update a Wikipedia page or whatever. And although it was static, it was completely decentralized and it was open source. So all these foundational interprotocols like HTTP, which lets you set up a website, were open for use. And even though the internet is changing a lot, the legacy of this kind of decentralized, open protocol system still lives on. And it's one of the many reasons that we don't have to pay every time we open a web page, for example. And in terms of identity, it was pretty non-existent for this era. Like we weren't really producing data as individuals, we were just consuming it. And this period is often kind of looked back as an almost like Eden-like before the fall era, because you'll see what happened when Web 2 was born. So Web 2 is the internet that we're all familiar with now. And if Web 1 was the kind of read-only, non-interactive internet, Web 2 is often referred to as a read and write internet. So this kind of ushered in the birth of social media applications like Twitter or Facebook and interactive websites like GitHub where you could compose things together. I mentioned Wikipedia pages before. That's another kind of classic Web 2 example. But as Web 2 became more interactive, it also became more centralized. So you now have 5 companies known as FANGs, that's Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, that control over more than half of the entire market cap, which is, just astonishing how much the internet has kind of consolidated over these forces. And this is, problematic for a couple reasons, but I'm going to focus particularly on how it's shaping the way that we relate to personal data and identity. And I think it sort of goes without saying that, digital identity and personal data really is the core of Web 2. So anytime you interact, anytime you send a message, you're generating personal data. In order to exist in most Web 2 spaces, you need a digital identity. So you need a profile, or you need a login, or a PFP, and all of this stuff kind of consolidates and grows out your data profile. So the first problem with this model is, I think, one that most people will be aware of. It's very, very surveillance heavy. And you not only have the kind of very scary, dystopian, like government-level surveillance that you see around the world. I think China's probably one of the examples where this is most intense, and they have their kind of social credit system where, they can track, for example, like if you've paid your bills on time, and if not, you might be banned from, buying a train ticket, and they can cross-reference everything that you've done online. But we also have the kind of like softer corporate surveillance, which is just where private companies build out these really complex profiles and sell and trade on your data and kind of bombard you with ads. And then you kind of have a fusion of the three, so scandals like Cambridge Analytica, where your data might be sold and utilized for political purposes. And I think something that's like quite interesting about online surveillance is that the real world increasingly is becoming easier to surveil in some ways than the digital world because of the power of facial recognition and of AI. So we're kind of hitting a tipping point where it might be that digital spaces become easier to operate in if you are doing something like protesting or organizing or even just doing something that you want to remain private. And that leaves us with like a big dilemma on our hands because the online world is, very, very vulnerable to invasive data practices. So the second problem that you have is something that I call identity lock-in. And this stems from the fact that in Web 2, you really don't own your own data and you don't own your digital identity at all. So the platform that you are using does. So for example, if you go onto Facebook, like Meta retains your profile, and you can't just take the network that you built on it, like the social graph of all your friends and your followers, and go somewhere else. And this, creates a real problem because all of these platforms tend to follow what's called, they tend to follow a kind of similar business model that's often referred to as like the attract-extract model. So when Web 2 platforms starts, they typically rely on offering really good experiences and terms and conditions to users to sort of lure them in. So they'll have really great data policies. They'll usually give creators really high revenue fees. You'll get to do loads of cool stuff. And then over time, as their network effect grows stronger, and as you become like more dependent and beholden on them to participate in communities or message your friends, the power dynamic starts to change. So, for example, being like a young person today without using Snapchat or TikTok or whatever is very, very difficult. And so they start to realize that instead of having to like attract you with good experiences, they can extract your data. And at this point, usually the quality of the online experience starts to drop off. You start having massive data scandals. And also the royalty fees and the rewards that like users and creators on the platform drop, sometimes to 0%. So it becomes increasingly hard to make a living on these platforms. And if you had the capacity to own your identity and own your follow account and own the history of all the things you've done, you could migrate much more easily off of these platforms and bring everything that you've built with you. And this would massively change the power dynamic between users and companies. And also in this model, it means that you as a user would actually own your data, so it would be you who can monetize it instead of the conglomerate. So you'd probably have like a third party that you would sell your data to that would then decide what advertisements you receive, and it would work, externally that way. So there's an economic incentive. And I think, there is something unfair in the current model where these companies make vast and vast and vast amounts of money off of our behavior, but none of us really see any profit or returns on that. Oops, wrong way. Sorry, guys. And then the third problem is poor verification. So despite the kind of massive pools of information that these companies have on us, it's actually incredibly hard to verify a lot of the information that you want to verify online. So like, I think everyone here is probably unfortunately familiar with the concept of a catfish, where like someone pretends to be, someone they're not. And you not only have sort of like interpersonal one-on-one identity fraud in these environments, but you also have mass-scale sort of system collapse, because the current way that the internet is structured makes it very easy to create massive amounts of bots and do what are called like Sybil attacks, where you start distorting internet traffic. So you could use it either to like collapse a website, but you can use it to sort of create a deceptive sense of popularity. It's something that like influencers and like politicians do a lot, is harnessing these bots. And a lot of these problems are set to get a lot worse under AI. So to go back to the issue of kind of one-on-one fraud, you have this problem with deepfakes. You have people being able, I don't know if this has happened in Romania so much, but in UK, we've had lots of issues with people being able to steal your like contact book and then create a completely convincing replica of your voice. So they'll like call your parents and like ask for money, that sort of thing. But also, again, the sort of ease with which people can generate bots is increasing, and the convincingness of this bots. And this leads to a kind of secondary problem, which is how do you distinguish between bots and humans online? And also, how do you distinguish between content that's bot-generated and content that's human-generated? So there's one story that I think is really illustrative of the problem with not being able to do that, which is, do you guys know about the tale of when there was like a fake image of the Pentagon catching fire, and it was AI generated, but it caused the S&P in the markets to drop by 0.3%, and billions and billions and billions of dollars were lost. So even like, these massive institutions cannot distinguish between like fake and real news in the face of AI. And also, so just onto the next slide. Oh, there's an image missing, sorry guys. So also like another sort of issue with AI and sort of like the future that we go into is it's not just going to be these identity challenges, the identity verification issues that are going to get worse and worse. It's also the problem with surveillance. So AI thrives on having massive data sets. So it has this incentive to kind of gather as much data as possible and then consolidate it. And it also thrives on pattern recognition. So as it accumulates this data, it can start piecing together very disparate behaviors or trends, like in your personal behavior, but also like across populations. And increasingly, it's looking like the future of AI is going to be agentic. So this is where you have a personal AI agent, and it does all the kind of mundane tasks that you would really not want to do yourself. So Meredith Whittaker, who's the Signal, she's not the founder, I've suddenly forgotten her role, but anyway, Meredith Whittaker from Signal recently gave a speech about this that went viral, where she talks about how one of the common activities that people imagine will be relying on AI agents to do for us is, booking concert tickets, scheduling the concert in your diary, and then messaging your friends to say the tickets are booked, these sort of activities. But to do that, it would need access to your debit cards, it would need access to your browser history, it would need access to your personal calendar, and it would need access to your messaging applications. So you can see how deep its access will go. And all of this information will then be bundled, and then it will be sent to a server, an external server, that even if a company or a government isn't actively accessing, it can still be very easily hacked. And it creates these sort of honeypots for hackers. But beyond surveillance and identity problems, one of the issues that you have with AI is it's a very, very centralizing technology. So as I mentioned, AI thrives on massive data sets. So it's this idea that you, again, accumulate, you create these kind of monopolies. One or a couple companies have, outsized power. But it also is unbelievably expensive to train AI, like the cost of the computes and the GPUs. So it's very hard to distribute. And the more centralized the internet becomes, the more you see this exacerbation of the imbalance between users and the companies that operate it. So all of this is to say that we have some problems in Web 2, particularly around digital identity. And I am now going to talk about Web 3 and how Web 3 seeks to solve it. So Web 3, the goal is to restore, really, the kind of open, decentralized nature of the early internet, where everyone owned the internet altogether and you didn't have these big, all-powerful corporations, but to maintain the interactiveness. So you still get the experiences of Web 2, but with a different power dynamic. And if Web 1 is thought of as a read-only internet and Web 2 is a read and write internet, Web 3 is known as the read, write, and own internet. So you own your own data and you own your digital identity. And as a lot of people will know, Web 3 is centered around blockchain. That's the kind of core technology that underlies it. And blockchain was born with Bitcoin, which burst into the scene in 2008, and it was a response to the financial crisis. And the goal of Bitcoin was to remove banks and third parties as this kind of centralized institution that controlled the monetary system and did things like issued the currency or determined whether or not you could access whatever money you owned and all these other things. And instead of using banks, to start using the blockchain itself. And the blockchain is basically a digital ledger where all of the information is completely visible to anyone who wants to go and check it. So it's very, very hard to tamper with it or to commit fraud. And the blockchain itself and this record of transactions, in the case of Bitcoin, is maintained not by a single force, but by a distributed network of lots of different decentralized computers. And it's very hard to seize control of a blockchain system or, say, of the Bitcoin network, because you would have to seize control of enough of the computers in that entire network. So it develops what's called like a censorship resistance approach, where it remains immune, again, to like centralized capture. And the hope is to start, extending to do what Bitcoin did for finance to identity, and to start using blockchain to kind of restore ownership. But for a long time, blockchain was not fit for purpose for any kind of identity use cases, because, as I mentioned, all of the data on the blockchain is actually publicly visible. It's like recorded on this ledger. So it would obviously be a disaster to use it for anything personal or any kind of sensitive information. But recently that changed. So there was a breakthrough in a field called zero-knowledge cryptography. And zero knowledge, put very simply, it allows one party to prove to another party using cryptography that a statement is true without proving how they know it. So, for example, you could prove that you're over 18 without revealing your exact birth date using cryptography. And this allowed a sort of combination of the censorship resistance and the transparency and the tamper-proof qualities of blockchain to now work alongside privacy. And this tech only really burst onto the scene about a year ago. It only became sort of production ready. So you're suddenly seeing this absolute blossoming of really exciting experiments in the digital identity space. And very few of them are widespread because the tech is so new. But I think what's so exciting about this topic is it's like a real glimpse into the future of the internet, and this stuff is starting to proliferate. And I imagine that in like 5 or 10 years' time, everyone will be using it, but they won't even be knowing that they're using it because it'll be very subtle and kind of on the back end. So let's explore now how this combination of zero-knowledge tech and blockchain that constitutes so much of Web3 is solving the problems that we discussed earlier. So problem number 1, which was surveillance and invasive data practices. And as I mentioned, Rarify Labs, the company that I work on, specifically focuses on digital identity in Web3. And this was our forte. So we were able to combine ZK and blockchain, and we were kind of thinking like, okay, what is we wanted to tackle like the most socially important issues. So we were like, where in society do you most need privacy and the kind of privacy that ZK can afford, but you also want things to be like absolutely tamper-proof and like total clarity over results. And we were like, voting's the most important thing we could work on. So we created a tool called Freedom Tool. And how it works is you take your passport and you use your mobile phone to scan it. There's like a little chip inside the passport, and all the data inside your passport is then verified on your phone. So none of the information ever leaves the phone. It never goes into a centralized server. No one can access any of this data. But you use zero-knowledge proofs to then give yourself an anonymous pass that says, like, I'm over 18 and I'm of whatever nationality I need to be to vote. And then you can cast an anonymous vote and it gets published onto the blockchain, and all of the results are public because they're on this blockchain, so anyone can go and check them and count them. And we released this in sort of like mid of last year, and it immediately got picked up. And the first use case was actually with a sort of Russian opposition activist called Mark Fagin. And it was following the elections in Russia, and he wanted to host a protest referendum to see whether or not people in Russia agreed that the election process was legitimate. So they were invited to vote on whether or not that was the case with this referendum. And it was, he never expected the whole of the Russian population to use this technology. It was more a tool for him to gauge the sentiments of the community that he was connected to because of the situation in Russia with surveillance and the high penalties for protests. It was very, very difficult for him to gauge the sentiments of the people that he was trying to fight on their behalf of. So he conducted this voting experiment, and over 30,000 people participated in it, which was much higher than expected because just voting alone was considered to be an act of protest, so it came with a lot of risks. And it was very interesting as well to see with privacy technology how you actually get people to trust and use it, because that can be a big barrier. And we discovered that most people actually weren't interested in understanding the technology, they trusted him. And so because he promoted it, they were willing to take that risk and cast these votes. And the Kremlin did not like it. So they did actually attempt to attack the infrastructure, but because it was completely decentralized, and because there was no central server and none of this data was going into a single point, there was actually nothing for them to attack. They couldn't go after the users, they didn't know who was using it. So what they did is they just complained about it to Apple. And they launched I forget the proper name for it, it's not like a lawsuit, but they filed against it, and they said that they were certain that some of the passports must be counterfeit. And it got temporarily removed and then popped back up. But I think this is an example that really illustrates the power of blockchain to withstand capture, because it worked, and it withstood sort of Kremlin protest. And after it survived this attack in Russia, it was then adopted by dissidents in Iran, and they also used it for an almost identikit protest where Iranians voted on whether or not they thought the presidential elections were legitimate. And then after that, it was adopted by MPs, opposition MPs in Georgia, and they used it for anonymous and tamper-proof polling in the run-up to the Georgian elections. And they also had a plan that if it worked, they would use the tool to implement experiments in liquid democracy. So this is when, instead of just voting once on a national election, you vote often on lots of different types of legislation as the government remains in power. And it's very, very difficult to do with current non-digital infrastructure because the cost of hosting an election is so high. But with these tools, it becomes, minuscule. So I think the average cost per voter with a physical election is $10, and with this it drops down to 0.03 cents. So you can start to experiment with democratic models in a different way. So that is just one example of how these tools can help with issues around surveillance and also around veracity and truthfulness in online spaces. And problem number 2 is identity lock-in. So, that was the issue of not owning your identity and not being able to port it. And there's been like a recent breakthrough called ZK-TLS, and this is when you use zero-knowledge technology to prove something from a web browser and to port it out of that browser. So the proof is generating, for example, like I have a certain rating on this website. And one of the apps or tools that has become most popular is this app called Nosh. So it lets Deliveroo drivers and food delivery drivers generate proofs of their reputation and then transfer it out to restaurants and to other apps so that they don't get locked into like one single application. And actually, we experimented a little bit at Rarify Labs and with Ramo with building tools that use ZK-TLS, and we did something called the blue tick registry. So we let people generate proofs from Twitter that they had a blue tick on their profile and use it as like evidence that they weren't a robot to pass like captcha tests and to show that they were verified humans. So this is like a very nascent and early stage of experimentation online, but it is working, and we're starting to see these apps blossom. And they're also, appropriately, they're known as vampire attacks. So I thought it would be like very fitting being here in Transylvania because you're leeching the resources from one site to like strengthen yourself and then powering it. So you break that kind of network effect that Web 2 platforms rely on. And then the third problem that I wanted to focus on is, I didn't write the solution, but it's, this issue of how do you verify identity? And the use case that I wanted to focus on is something called proof of humanity. So as AI becomes like more powerful and more sophisticated, one of the big issues, as I mentioned, is how do you distinguish between AI and how do you distinguish between humans? And all of the traditional technologies that we've had, like, the kind of captures or when you fill out, clicking different images to show that you're not a robot, none of these really work anymore because almost anything that a human can accomplish in an online space, an AI can accomplish. So this sort of like led security experts to be like, okay, well, what can humans do that bots can't? And sadly, it almost always relates back to your like physical biometrics. So like having fingerprints, having irises, or sometimes government documents. And so there's this whole suite of tools emerging that allow people to generate proofs from their fingerprints or whatever. And the other reason that these tools are becoming so popular is because if you're trying to combat AI and bots, you want to make the barrier as difficult to replicate as possible and also as valuable. So you want to have like a kind of cost incentive for people not to start farming out or selling whatever it is they have that allows them to prove that they're a human, because if bots can acquire it cheaply, they will, and then they'll start to overwhelm systems. So you kind of, again, you fall back on things that are very, very scarce, which is like unique physical attributes. So the company that has gained like the most traction and renown for generating proofs of humanity is called WorldCoin, and very interestingly, it was actually founded by Sam Altman, who also founded OpenAI, and it's a very, very controversial company, and there's a lot of issues with how it operates, but I think it's like an interesting case study to see how people are working on these things, where they released a device called an orb that you can use to scan your eyeball, and you then get given a pass that you own that you can generate proofs from to say, like, I am a unique human, but without revealing your personal details or the biometric data associated with your eyeball. And then you can access gated spaces without bots. And it's there's been a lot of controversy around this case because they gave people cryptocurrency, like tokens, in order to bootstrap the network and to get enough people using it so that applications would put WorldCoin filters like into the applications. But there are other methods. So actually, the passport infrastructure that I mentioned earlier could be one. And I think the reason I wanted to talk about it, even though a lot of the solutions aren't really perfect, is that I think ZK and blockchain stands the best chance of creating good infrastructure to combat bots, because if you have the infrastructure, for distinguishing between humans and bots controlled by a centralized company as well. And they are influencing the entire state of who gets to prove what, and every time they're online and every time they send a proof, you end up exacerbating the issue of surveillance. So we really want whatever these tools are to be decentralized. And I would just sort of like echo the sentiment that I expressed earlier of AI being a centralizing force and blockchain being a decentralizing one. So often wanting them in counterbalance when you build out global systems. And yeah, so that is, the sort of overview of the biggest problems around personal data and identity in Web3, in Web2, and how Web3 is solving them. And I think we do a question time now.
Thank you very much, Kitty.
Thank you.